Welcome again to Tales of the Trade. I'm Chirag Desai. And on today's episode, we're continuing our conversation about the content business, specifically the business of podcasts, with James Cridland, founder and editor of Podnews.net, a not-so-little platform that has become the place to get podcasting news and so much more.
Somebody once told me, I was at a conference in New York, and somebody said, "Oh, you'll own Pod.News, won't you?" And I said, yeah, of course I will. And then for the next 10 minutes, hid away in a corner of the pub.
And bought the domain?
Bought the domain.
I don't know why I remember this number. It's just stuck in my head. But when I first followed Podnews sometime in early 2018, the newsletter had 3,300 subscribers. James has always published the number on the homepage, which means I can do a quick check to see that number stands at over 32,000 today, all of whom receive a daily newsletter about what's the latest within the podcast industry. And while that growth alone makes the journey of Podnews fascinating, it doesn't stop there. The platform on which the newsletter, the website, podcast homepages, research pieces, classifieds, and runs is something James continues to build out himself, adding new features and information points along the way. So for example, as a podcaster, you can quickly see which directories your podcast is listed in or isn't, or if your episodes don't hit the industry standard for audio loudness. James was in Dubai a few weeks ago to keynote the annual Dubai Podfest, hosted by the Dubai Media Office, which is where we sat down to talk about all things pod news and all things podcasting as well. Now, leading into this conversation, I was thinking about the parallels to his story from outside the world of podcasts. A few tech stalwarts come to mind: Ben Thompson, who writes Stratechery, news, research pieces, and podcasts in and around the tech world. There's also John Gruber, one of my favorites around the Apple world. He also collaborates on a podcast with Ben. And to me, there's an obvious commonality here, that while there is a supporting team, they're essentially one-person companies.
There's an excellent book by Paul Jarvis that I read at just the right time, which is called Company of One. And it is talking about the fact that it is okay to have a company which is just
more
one
than
person.
okay. Yeah.
It is just fine. You do not have to have offices and all of that. You don't have to strive for more staff and build additional offices around the world and everything else. It is just fine having a company of one person. And I read that at exactly the right time. So I think that was a very useful thing.
Now, to create that great company of one, you also need to have that perfect intersection. James comes from a background in radio that spans 35 years. He's also got a tech background. He wrote his first RSS feed in 2005. And for context, that's a whole year before Spotify was even founded, a throwback to a time when podcasters were writing and hosting their own podcast feeds. In 2017, James was already writing a weekly radio newsletter. And while talking to a friend at a radio conference that year, he decided to explore the idea of a dedicated podcast newsletter.
And I remember thinking, this is going to be difficult to get a daily newsletter out there, because I don't think there's enough news.
There's enough news, yeah. At least 10 years ago,
Certainly the case now. Yeah. There is way too much news, but back then it's actually quite hard. Mm-hmm. But I think, I'm lucky in that I've got a tech background, but I've also got an audio creator background. So I've worked in the radio industry for 35 years. So those two things came together, plus one of my first jobs in radio was writing radio commercials, which you need to be very quick and very fast at writing accurately. All of these three things kind of collide with what I do, because I do the tech partially because I find that bit fun, but also partially because I can then get it to do some serious time-saving stuff. But I also understand enough of the writing side and the journalism side, and obviously having been involved in the industry for a long time, and certainly the audio industry, that's been interesting too. So I'm quite lucky that this opportunity, essentially came along of something that all of my strengths, if you like, collided to allow me to do something such as this. Now, you ask me, when did it turn from being a side hustle to a main job? I think that was about 9 months in, when I thought, well, I've been running this for 9 months. I had people approach me to sponsor it. So that was lovely.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, what I should probably do is I should probably have a classified ad section. because, I've tried classified ads in the past for other newsletters that I've run. They don't work. It's a waste of time. So I'm going to code myself a classified ad system in as little time as possible, was my plan. So I set myself a day to code the classified ad system. And the morning was spent coding user accounts and all of that boring stuff that you have to have. The afternoon was spent writing the actual classified ad system and how it would interface with Stripe to, for credit cards payments, and blah, blah, blah. And I live in Australia. And so one of the benefits of living in Australia is that I can do lots of dev work during the day and no one notices because everybody else is asleep.
Right.
So I then go to put the thing live, go to sleep, woke up in the morning to see that I had received my first order, and it was an order for over $500.
Wow. Okay.
And I thought, maybe I should, apply some styling to this and make it look nice. And yeah, maybe this is a thing. So, so that was a very affirming experience. What was quite funny is that if you had, right back in the early days, if you had pressed the button that said, I've forgotten my password, you'd have been taken to a page that said, congratulations, you're the first person to forget your password. And as such, we haven't written any code to do with that.
That's funny.
Email me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So there was an awful lot of that, very, very just trying things and seeing what sticks.
I know that, and you have that disclaimer on the site when someone does try to put an ad in, is that you actually don't see the ads and you maintain a bit of separation of that. And that's also something that you've just coded in that way so that this section is automated and therefore, you focus on sort of building the news for the day and then this gets attached to it in the newsletter and that's that.
Yeah. It used to be that I didn't see them at all until I was looking at the published version on the website.
Right.
I now see it just before I press the publish button.
Is there a reason for that?
Only because after 6 years, I thought it was probably time for me to write a content management system for me to enter the day's newsletter in something that wasn't just a SQL database view. So I've actually got something which is a little bit smarter. But I try to not be swayed by the advertising, by the supporters who are on the site as well, and by the sponsors. I think that's I now have somebody who sells the sponsors for me, so I don't have to necessarily worry about that. But I think it's a healthy thing to try and avoid avoid selling ads to the same people that you're writing a nasty story about. That's never really going to go down particularly well.
There's another commonality between the Ben Thompsons and the James Cridlands, which is the tech stack, or rather their control of the tech stack. A couple of years ago, for example, Ben Thompson launched Passport, a custom platform that now powers his entire subscription offering. And while there's something to be said about having control of the stack, I think the story here is about customization, whether it's in the form of features that aren't typically available on content platforms or just core business optimization.
I think a lot of what I do is spending as much time as possible getting rid of the stuff that I do which isn't creative, which isn't writing or learning or, reading. And so therefore, the code that I've written is very much, it's built only for me. And so one of the reasons why I can't take a day off is that it is impossible for anybody else to use this. But, it's built for me. It's built to enable me to very quickly publish, a newsletter, particularly, for example, today, as we record this, we're going into a big conference and I've got quite a busy day and I still haven't written the newsletter and it comes out at 3:00 this afternoon. Right. And at some point I've got to write it and then record it and then, and then all of that. So I need the publishing systems to be as quick as possible. And I think, being lucky enough to have learnt coding, to be able to then take away as much of this, as much of the pressing buttons stuff as possible. Yes, I could have used, Beehive or MailChimp or anything else. A, it would have been far more expensive, but also B, it wouldn't have been as flexible in terms of allowing me to do the variety of things which I do with the content, as well. And I'm a big fan of reusing content as much as possible. So, if I do an interview with somebody, that will go into the Podnews Weekly Review, which is a long-form podcast that I do, but it will also be edited down as a piece of written copy for another podcasting newsletter that we own. So I think, just sort of making the most out of the content that we have is a very important part, and owning your own tech is very helpful in doing that.
But I think it also expands sort of the Podnews platform and empire as a result, right? Because the code that you've written is not only stuff that allows you to input stuff into the newsletter, but it's also it's all the public pages on podnews.net, and that includes all the research you do. It includes podcast pages for shows and allowing and you've created essentially a way for people to not only discover podcasts or look up podcasts. You have tech recommendations at the bottom of that. All of that is, of course, custom code that you've written, right? So I think it also creates this sort of very integrated, hence I keep calling it the Podnews platform, right? It creates this integrated platform that allows you to do a lot of things.
Yeah. And I think it's, I built it specifically because I needed to link to a podcast, but I didn't want to link to Apple Podcasts, because at the time I owned an Android phone, and linking to Apple, it was next to useless. Yeah. So I thought, right, well, I need to link somewhere, but not enough podcasts have their own websites.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of wanted to do that bit. And so ended up having to build that because I had to. Similarly, I ended up having to build a press release section on the website where I could paste press releases, because people started sending me a press release. Yeah. And I had nothing that I could do with that. So I had to build myself something for that. So quite a lot of it comes back to, how do I produce a newsletter, very quickly and easily?
Yeah.
And what tools are there out there to enable that newsletter to be as good as possible?
The podcast industry saw a boom starting in 2018, which only continued to blossom amidst the lockdowns of 2020. This also meant that advertisers around the world started looking at podcasts a lot more seriously. And that's when someone named Brian Barletta approached James with the idea of launching an industry newsletter dedicated to ad tech. More on that and Podnews' acquisition of the podcast Business Journal right after this short break. Welcome back to Tales of the Trade. I'm Chirag Desai. In May 2023, Podnews acquired the podcast Business Journal, a research-driven newsletter that has now become a weekly publication from Podnews. James also hosts a weekly podcast called the Podnews Weekly Review with Sam Sethi, CEO of True Fans, a podcasting creator platform. He speaks at podcast events around the world, including the 2024 Dubai Podfest, where we had this conversation, publishes guides and research pieces. Before the break, we spoke about the tech stack that James has built to run Podnews. And in 2020, when Brian Barletta approached James to launch Sounds Profitable, it was built on the same stack.
So I built the Podnews platform initially so that it would do two newsletters. It would do the Podnews newsletter and it would do my radio newsletter, which at the time was rather a lot larger because it had 3,700 people.
Right.
And so therefore, I built it so that it would be the new home for my radio newsletter as well. And then when Brian came to me and said, I've got this idea for a newsletter about advertising tech, originally that was the genesis of that, and wondered if I could help him with the tech. Obviously, I then had a platform which, with a couple of extra coding changes, would deal quite happily with the Sounds Profitable site. So we did that for a couple of years.
Yeah.
They very much outgrew what I was capable of supporting.
Right.
And actually, I had quite a lot of people coming up to me and saying, you should be releasing this platform as a tool for other people to use.
That was where I was thinking.
Yeah. And I do not want to be a software engineer. I am not a very good software engineer. There's a lot of kludges behind the scenes. There's a lot of things that I have to do. So I had no interest in doing that sort of side. But it was quite useful, again, get the most out of the content that you create. At the time, I was actually running that code for 4 different websites.
Okay.
So that was quite useful. But in recent years, because Podnews has grown and grown, it's now the code will only deal with that one site because I can't. I'm not going to, run other people's sites for them.
Right.
Much more enjoyable to grow my own thing than grow somebody else's.
Sure.
So
you're not affiliated with Sounds Profitable now. It's just kind of run independently off Podnews, right?
So I helped them at the beginning, and they're now doing their own thing very successfully. I think Brian has a number of staff. I think 5 or 6 staff now, and all of that. Which but it's a very different. It's a trade organization for the industry these days that also happens to have a newsletter and a few other things. And that's very different to, where I am, which is I'm a newsletter, and I'm not there to change the industry. I'm not there to set new standards and guidelines. I'm there to write a newsletter, and that's what my job is. So I think, there's a clear difference there in terms of that.
So now let's talk about the Podcast Business Journal, right? So that's a slightly different story for you in terms of, you called it an acquisition, in terms of inheriting this newsletter and this sort of, that did all of this amazing work. But today you're running that in parallel with Podnews. And but talk me through sort of how that got started.
So I've known Eric Rhodes, who was the publisher of the Podcast Business Journal for a long, long time. And that product was a great product. It was lots of daily news, written by an excellent editor, Ed Ryan, who had been doing this job for 30, 40 years in radio and in, I possibly shouldn't say 40. I'm not sure he's that old, but certainly 25, 30 years, in terms of radio and latterly in terms of podcasting as well. He'd done a fantastic job, and he had had enough, and he wanted to go and live by the beach somewhere, and all credit to him. And so Streamline came to us and said, "Would you like to buy the Podnews Business Journal?"
Interesting. So it was initiated by them in terms of looking at that. Okay.
And we looked at the numbers, and we thought, well, actually, this would be a very useful addition. And the reason why it would be a useful addition is if we were to turn the Podcast Business Journal into a weekly publication rather than another daily,
right?
And A, that gets rid of a competitor, so that's a good thing.
Sure.
But also B, it helps with 2 of the reasons why people unsubscribe from the Podnews newsletter.
Okay.
Reason number 1 is we talk about other countries than America.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. And so, why would I be interested in, what's going on in the United Arab Emirates, for heaven's sake? So that's the first thing. And the second thing was too much. I can't deal with a daily.
Yeah, that I can see.
A daily email. And so by offering a weekly email, which solely focuses on the business side of podcasting in the US, that's all it does. That actually fixed both of the issues that we had with unsubscribes.
Interesting. Okay.
And allowed us to move forward. So that's been very useful. But also, what I was very surprised at is when we actually signed the papers and did the deal and everything else. Of course, we got the old website, we got all of the subscriber information. And the subscriber information, interestingly, around 50%, 50-60% were brand new people to the Podnews network that weren't getting our stuff before. And so being able to grow our content out in that way and hit, another 5,000 people, was super helpful. So, so that was a very good acquisition. I'm not necessarily sure that the acquisition made money. That's a different conversation, but
Sure.
but was it a strategic, interesting thing to do? Yes, that was one thing. I've been offered another industry newsletter, which I couldn't see any benefit from buying, so I said no. But I think that's been very interesting, and that's been the first time that I've bought somebody else's brand, and changed that brand to be something that works alongside the master brand, if you like.
I don't want to say like one advice, because that's maybe not, it's a bit hard, I think, to collate everything into one advice. But if there was something that, if someone were to try to build a sort of content space for themselves, and especially by themselves, because that's the one thing I think that's interesting.
I think I can give one piece of advice for anybody that is doing anything in terms of content.
Okay.
And that is work on, the number one thing is to work on your workflow. Look at your workflow and go, okay, how can I make this as simple as possible for me to produce great content? So a couple of examples. The Podnews newsletter comes out at 6 or 7 a.m. New York time, at about lunchtime in Europe, and in the early afternoon here.
Yeah. And
the reason why it comes out at those times is nothing to do with the best time for a newsletter to come out. The reason why is that's 9 o'clock at night, my time when I'm at home.
Right.
And that allows me to spend a day working for somebody else if I want to. It's all to do with the workflow. When can I publish that I know that I can still produce something? The reason why the Podnews newsletter is a lot of very short bullet points with a couple of sentences, and that's it most of the time, if I'm not digging into something, is again because there is no way from a workflow point of view of doing what, for example, the Podcast Business Journal was doing and writing a full page for every single story, which is essentially rewriting a press release and blah, blah, blah. That I've been there, I've done that. You can't run a business that way. So again, coming back to workflow, it's really important just to save as much time as possible on everything that you're doing that isn't the final product. So, formatting things, laying it out beautifully on a page, all of that, just automate as much of that as you possibly can. And so I have a little script, for example, on my laptop when it's time to publish the newsletter, and that script goes off. It's a mix of, Apple script and lots of other complicated stuff, which goes off, grabs the images, grabs the audio, re-encodes the audio, does the transcripts, uploads it all to the web server, does all of this stuff all completely automatically, so that I don't have to press all of these ridiculous buttons to do everything. Yeah. So that I don't mess it up. Is the other thing.
Sure.
And so that it's just quick and simple in terms of getting it out. I think getting the workflow right is the overall, function of actually, getting a content product right.
How long does that script take to run through every day?
It only takes a couple of minutes. But I mean, obviously, that's after I've written everything.
Right.
After I've done.
So it's running through the compiled information and structuring it into newsletter. Because I think even your links are scripted, right? Like you add all these sort of the UTM tags and everything.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're not doing that manually anyway.
Yeah. So as much of that is automated as possible. I just write every day into a text file.
I don't want to say like, what is this going to be like 5 years into the future, but let's say over the next couple of years, like, so what are you looking at in terms of, we called it the Podnews platform, the Podnews network, maybe the Podnews empire?
As a British person, I steer clear of the word empire.
Fair enough.
Never ends well. So I think what I would like is to make sure that, again, reuse as much of that content. I'm very aware that there's a set of people out there who are fans of podcasts, but aren't in the podcast industry and aren't really very interested in, what new feature has Megaphone released today and all of that kind of stuff. That's not particularly thrilling or exciting to them, but they would be interested in hearing that Alex Goldman has a new show out, or or PJ Vogt has a new show out, or whoever it might be.
And not together, just FYI.
Yeah, not most certainly not. I think there's a story there.
Yeah, there is.
So I think that there is definitely something in something aimed at a podcast fan rather than a podcast industry insider. So perhaps that might be nice to end up doing in the future. I call it the Podnews Network only because I own the domain name podnews.network. Somebody once told me, I was at a conference in New York, and somebody said, "Oh, you'll own pod.news, won't you?" And I said, yeah, of course I will. And then for the next 10 minutes, hid away in a corner of the pub.
And bought the domain?
Bought the domain. So, yes. But, so yeah, so I think that there's definitely something there. But in terms of very much keeping it around the podcasting world, you know, that's my goal, really.
You're looking back at this sort of journey now. Is there anything you would have liked to do differently?
There are plenty of technical things I'd like to have done differently, but then that's always the way, isn't it? Yeah. But you know, I mean, there are a few sort of sort of personal things in there. But I think I'm very lucky in what I've done, what I've put together, and you know, it's certainly something that I think as radio enters a new chapter of perhaps not being as big as it was, perhaps not being as rich as it was, certainly. I think, you know, I was lucky to have found, I don't want to call it an escape route, because that would be slightly cheeky. Radio is still very, very popular, way more popular than podcasting. Right. But I was very lucky to have found, you know, an additional part of the audio industry there. So so I think I'm, you know, hopefully have done things in the right kind of way.
Are there any regrets today in terms of what you're doing? Anything that you would like to change significantly in the future, or even insignificantly, maybe?
You know, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, obviously sometimes the stories that you cover, people don't like the way that you have covered a particular story, and you lose them as a friend, or you lose them as somebody who will talk to you. You know, and occasionally I've had, you know, so
there are a few stories there, clearly.
Yeah, you know, so occasionally I've had people who I admire, but who have behaved badly, right. And when I've called out that bad behaviour, you know, for entirely understandable reasons, they won't talk to me anymore, and that's a bit of a shame. I mean, it's interesting. Before coming here to the UAE, I was on a Pacific island at a media conference on the island of Niue.
Right.
And this particular island has a population of 1,600 people. And one of the journalists on that island was saying, it's really hard for me because I will do stories about the hospital, for example, on the island, and now there are doctors who will not treat me.
Wow.
Because I have covered stories that they did not like. I mean, you know, and so from my point of view, somebody that's a bit grumpy and won't talk to me anymore is no big deal. It's not getting in the way of my children getting hospital attention.
Sure.
You know, so frankly, I shouldn't be, you know, a whining person about that.
I have one last question for you, but which is why Australia?
Oh, I met a girl. Yes, that's normally how these things work.
Yeah, that is normally how these things work.
Yes. Okay. So she's from Australia.
Right.
So therefore, when our daughter was 3, we were looking for schools in the UK, and you know, and my wife now was saying, well, you know, what are we? The education system in the UK is really difficult and it's really complicated, and I don't understand it. It's much easier in Australia.
Right.
And I said, well, is there anything stopping us moving? And I mean, of course, there were plenty of things stopping us moving.
Sure, yeah.
But nevertheless, it was a very good choice, unless you want to travel and go to conferences a lot.
That was my conversation with James Cridland, editor of Podnews.net. Of course, I couldn't let James go without getting his thoughts on the state of the podcast industry. That's on a dedicated episode coming out tomorrow, so stay tuned. Tales of the Trade is brought to you by Amaya Media. I'm Chirag Desai. Original music for the show was composed by Rainer Erlings.